When I realized I was speaking on Mother's Day, I started looking through all the different mothers in the Bible, and and I read a bunch of stories, and one I found particularly interesting, and it's in Genesis 16, and Keegan is going to come and read those verses for us. So Genesis 16, 1 through 16.
Abram's wife Sarah had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarah said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family." And Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan for 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram replied to Sarah, "Here your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarah mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going?" She replied, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarah." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority." The angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her, "You have conceived, and you will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El-Roi," for she said, "In this place you have been actually seen, the one who sees me." That is why the well is called Bir Lahai-Roi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him.
Thank you, Keegan, for reading that. I'm looking forward to when you do the whole sermon. Now, we know this story reasonably well, and when I was reading the story, what really struck me was we often focus on the Sarah side of the story and not the Hagar side of the story. So this morning, we're really going to look at the Hagar side of the story. I'm going to use Abraham and Sarah as their names, not Abram and Sarai, just because it's easier and more familiar to us. So when I talk about them, I'll use Abraham and Sarah. And it's interesting that when Abram's name was changed to Abraham by God, it's one of the few words in Hebrew that it's meaningless. The actual word Abram does not have any meaning in the Hebrew language. Abraham does not have any meaning in the Hebrew language. So when God gave him a name, he didn't only give him a name, he gave him a name that was completely unique to Abram at the time. We know that Hagar was given to Sarah from Egypt. It was a gift from the time they spent in Egypt. We know she was Egyptian. Most commentaries would say that she was probably black. The picture I had when I tried to find a picture of Hagar on the internet, try and find a picture of Hagar that isn't a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman. It's difficult. We really need to update our biblical pictures to something a little more culturally relevant. So she was definitely dark-skinned, Egyptian, and probably black. Her name means stranger, or literally one who does not belong. That's what Hagar means. She was an outsider in the house of Abraham. She's called a slave, or a shifka in Hebrew. It means literally to belong to the mistress. So she was the property of Sarah. In some ways, the story of Hagar really mirrors the story of the Jews. She was plucked out of her country and sent to live with people of a different nationality. And most of the Jewish existence has been a nation where they are getting taken out of their land and go to live in another land in a foreign country. She was taken and she was given to Sarah. She went to live with Abraham and Sarah, and it would have been strange food, strange gods, strange traditions. Everything for her would have been different in living in that land. And she was given to Sarah as a servant, and she was given to her knowing that Sarah didn't have any children. And there's, language issues, cultural issues, all sorts of issues that she would have had. And I can only imagine that she would have been a bit lonely and homesick for Egypt. We know the story. Sarah gets desperate. She can't have a child. She wants a child. God has promised her a child, but she takes things into her own hands, and she gives her to Abraham to have a child. Now, this seems funny to us, but it would have been very culturally normative at the time. It would have been normal for a barren wife to give another woman to her husband in order to have a child, because children were, you had to have children. You had to have someone to look after you in your old age. You had to have someone who was going to carry on the line. And so it seems morally wrong to us when we read the story. It seems unusual and odd, but it was a fairly common custom of the time. If Sarah couldn't have a child, at least Abraham could, and the family could continue on. Hagar gets pregnant, and she starts to resent Sarah. The word in Hebrew here, kalal, it means to make light of someone or to diminish someone, to make fun of someone. And we can see how that would happen. Hagar was a servant. She was just a piece of property. And all of a sudden she was pregnant, and if she had a son, she would be pregnant to the heir of that whole group of people. And so her station in life all of a sudden got quite increased. And her status would have been greatly improved from being the slave that she was. And of course, Sarah doesn't like being made fun of, and she gets offended, and so she gets mad. And guess what she does? She blames it on Abraham. So she goes to Abraham, "This is all your fault. You caused all this trouble. Now you fix it." Now, it's not good marriage advice or parenting advice, but that's what she did. He doesn't handle it particularly well. He looks back at her and says, "Hey, not my problem. You own her. She's your problem. You fix it." And so he just turns around and puts it back on her. Legally, he was correct. She was the property of Sarah. Sarah could do whatever she wanted. She could get rid of her. She could do whatever she wanted because she was just a piece of property. So what happens? Sarah starts to mistreat Hagar. In some of the versions, they use the word humble, and it's the same word that's used to describe how the Hebrews were treated by slaves in Egypt. And that's just kind of weird that this word is used there and it's again used later on. Sarah humbled the Egyptian, Hagar, as the Egyptians would later on humble the descendants of Sarah. And so there's a connection there. What this humbling entails, it doesn't give us a description, but clearly it was pretty severe and pretty bad. So bad that Hagar decides, I can't stay around here anymore, I need to leave. And so she flees from the relative safety of the community, and she heads out into the desert. And she decides, I'm going back to Egypt. So she heads south towards Egypt, which would have been a very difficult path to follow. It was not something that would have been easy. And she clearly was pretty desperate. And as she's going along this desert road, she has this extraordinary encounter with God. God sends an angel with a message from him. It's probably not a message she wanted to hear. He says, go back and submit to whatever your mistress tells you to do. Go back and humble yourself and live with Sarah and Abraham. And then the messenger, the angel, says, you'll have a son. Genesis 16:11 says, tell us that God commanded, you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. And Ishmael means God hears. God had heard the suffering of this slave girl. He had made a promise to Abraham and Sarah about their upcoming child, but at the same time, he still hears Hagar. And to me, that's pretty incredible. The important person in this story is Sarah. The important person is Abraham. But God hears the unimportant person in this story, which is Hagar. Sometimes I can feel a little insignificant in a big world, and it's comforting to know that God hears and sees. And so she has in the son a constant reminder that God hears her because of his name. Then she does something that she's the first person in the Bible to do this. She gives God a name. And she says, she calls him El Rui Ra'ah, the God who seeing sees. Not only the understanding that God sees, but God sees her as an individual, as a person. It says in verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. She responds with this idea that not only does God see her, he sees her as a person, and she sees him because he sees her. And to me, this is a pretty powerful message for us, especially for those who don't feel seen. People who think they're hiding in the shadows, thinking that nobody notices. They are heard and seen by God, and he allows that relationship to be reciprocated. He allows us to see him back. How comforting to know that the God of the universe sees and hears us, but wants us to be seen by him as well. I was talking a few weeks ago with someone, and they said that they were insignificant. Nobody ever notices them. They're invisible. And I noticed this person because they are very determined and strong, and they have a fierceness about them. Fierceness in a good way, but they don't see that in themselves. I wonder sometimes if people want to be invisible because they fear what people are going to see. They don't want to be seen because they think maybe they're not going to, measure up to something that person, that they won't fit the expectations. They're afraid of not being good enough. That's not the way that God sees us at all. And I told them, and I quoted the verse. I said, God sees you, and I see you, and we both think you're extraordinary. And those who know me know that this is a pet peeve of mine. People go around unnoticed all the time. People in the church go around unnoticed all the time. And it's something that I try to not overlook. We need to notice people. We need to see people. We need to be able to know what's going on with them and be a part of their lives. We need to make sure that people are seen and heard. And in this text, we have a great example of God seeing and hearing the stranger or the unnoticed people. We not only need to see the Sarahs of the world, we need to see the Hagars of the world. The strangers, the out-of-placers, the people who God clearly sees in spite of their place and their circumstances. So as the story goes on, she goes back and she humbles herself and she lives with Sarah. She has a son. She calls him Ishmael. And 14 years go by, and finally the promise of God is presented, and Sarah has a son, and she calls him Isaac. In Genesis chapter 21, we have the rest of the story here. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. She said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerns his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders, and then he sent her off with the boy. She went on her way, wandered into the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes, and she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I can't watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do you not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up, take him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes. She saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the desert, became an archer. And while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got for him a wife from Egypt. Ishmael is a young teenager. Isaac is born. All of a sudden, Ishmael's place in the community, in the family, has been turned over. He was once the heir, the favored son of the patriarch of the family, and that has been displaced. His father has turned his love towards this younger child, and he's making a big spectacle about it. He's having this big celebration. And how would you react in that situation? I think we all know how we react if we had someone who came and took our place in a family. We'd be upset. We'd be mad. I've been here for 14 years serving you as a son, and this little brat is getting all the attention. I'm upset by this. So what does he do? What does he do? He makes fun of the baby. The word here means to laugh out loud in scorn. So he scorns this child. Well, Sarah overhears it, and she gets upset, and not learning anything from the first time this happened, she goes straight back to Abraham and says, "This is all your fault. You take care of it again." But it's interesting that God intervenes here, this time directly with Abraham. God speaks directly to Abraham. He only speaks to Hagar through an angel. And I don't know why. It's one of the questions I have when I go through this. And God says to him, "Don't be upset. The promise I made to you through Isaac is good. It will follow through. But don't worry about Ishmael. I'll make him a great nation as well." We often talk about how difficult it was for Abraham to take Isaac on that journey of sacrifice, and how much pain it must have cost Abraham to think he would have to sacrifice his son. But we forget about this story. In this story, he's asked again to have his son Ishmael thrown out into the desert, to be put away. And as a father who's raised this kid for 14 years, it must have been a painful decision for him, just as it would have been to take Isaac out into the desert. So we have this idea here that the son who he's loved for 14 years is going to be put away, and he's sad about that. And God says to him, "Don't worry, I'll make sure he's taken care of." And this seems to appease Abraham, that this son would be taken care of. Again, not good parenting skills here. He gives him some water and a little bit of food, a little bit of water and a little bit of food, and he shoves them off into the desert and says, "Go live on your own somewhere." We can feel the anguish of Hagar the mother. Her child is exhausted. She has no water left to give them. They've used up all their water. They used up all their food. And her child is at the point of death. I don't know whether he's given up some of his water for her, because she seems to be better hydrated at this point, but she knows her son is dying. And so the only thing she can do as a mother, she doesn't want to see that suffering. So she hides her child, teenager, in this bush, and she goes off, as it says, a bow shot, so that she won't have to see him die. She was very distraught, as any mother would be. Last summer, I was visiting Sean's mother, and I think I might have told this story before, but she gave me a book, and in the book, it's a young boy of 10 years old who's fleeing the Russian invaders during the Second World War. He's German. So they're fleeing the Russian invaders, and they're trying to get to the American side of Germany so they can surrender to the American army. And the conditions during the Second World War in Germany were horrendous. And she gives me the book, and she says, "This is my story, except I was going from the American side towards the Russians, but the things that happened to this child happened to me and my family, and read it because it's my story and you can learn something about me." And so I read the book, and I was reading this particular section that was quite horrific, and the family was basically starving to death. And they have had no food for a very long time. They're eating whatever they can, and things are looking very bad for the family, and they're going to die. And in the margins of the page, she had wrote, "I had learned to live without food, but I couldn't learn to live without hope." And that really struck me, knowing Sean's mom, of her writing that little note in there. I had learned to live without food, but I couldn't learn to live without hope. And putting that in the picture of Hagar, thinking that your child is going to die, the only child that you have as a mother. As a parent, that little note in that book hit me pretty hard. And I can only imagine as a mother what it must be to watch your children starve to death, watch your children die of thirst, and how horrible that must be, how much mental anguish that person must have. So Hagar goes off a couple of 100 feet so she won't see him die. It says she goes off a bow shot. How long is a bow shot? I was thinking, well, this is another bad parenting tip, but when I was a kid, my parents gave us bows and arrows, and we didn't have a lot of money or a lot of things, and so we invented this game. So my brother would stand at the house, and I would go a couple 100 feet up the road, and he would shoot the arrow into the air, and you had to catch it when it came down. And if you caught the arrow, then you get to shoot the bow, because we only had one bow between the two of us. You get to shot the bow the next time. So I get pretty good at gauging how far an arrow would come up the road, and about 200 feet, is kind of normal for a normal bow shot. So she's off to the side, her child is dying, she's waiting for the child to die. And God again says to an angel, "Go down and tell her, I still hear her, I still see her, everything's going to be okay. Give your kid a drink, he's going to be a great nation, and everything's going to be fine." And so she gets up, she sees a well. It says God opens her eyes, she sees a well, she gets a drink, she gives it to her son, and they go off into the desert and they live as nomads. He becomes a great archer, as it says. She eventually goes back to Egypt, and she finds him a wife, and the Arab nation begins. In spite of her loss of status, her loss of a home, her loss of an occupation, as a mother, she looks after her son and he flourishes. We never hear that she marries or has more children. It does say in the first passage, it talks about his brothers in plural. Some scholars think that she went back and married Abraham after Sarah died. Genesis 25 talks about Abraham taking another wife whose name was Keturah. In Genesis 25 and in 1 Chronicles, it talks about Keturah being a slave or a concubine, someone given to Abraham to have children. So there's some idea that maybe Hagar went back and married Abraham after Sarah died. We don't know, and it's not even that relevant to the story, but just a little piece of history. It says that her son would be the father of many people too numerous to count, but he would be a wild donkey of a man. His hand would be against many people, and his hand would even be against his brothers. This is not a curse, but kind of a foretelling of the future. And sometimes when we get outside of God's will, we put things in motion that are not very helpful. Can you imagine what it would be like today if the Arab nations were peaceful, and how the Jewish-Arab relationship would be much different if those two nations could get along? I read a book that was written by the son of Hamas, and he just couldn't reconcile the fact that his father and his father's people were bombing their own people. That Hamas was killing more Arabs than they were killing Jews. And he says, that doesn't make any sense to me. Why are we killing our own people? Well, there's a purpose, son, you got to understand it. And he just couldn't. And he was in university one day, and there was a bunch of students sitting at a table, and he knew they were Christians. And they invited him over to their table. And he thought, maybe Christianity is something different. And he gets saved because he finds a Jesus that is loving and kind, but also just. And the justice of his Arab background was unkind and unloving, and he couldn't reconcile that. So we have on one side, Ishmael being a great nation, but having this conflict and turmoil in his life, but Isaac being promised to be a great nation, but prosperity and the promise of having God as their God for the rest of their generations. Why God chose it that way, I don't know. I have a lot of questions for him when I get to heaven, but it's what we have in history. And having the hindsight of history, we can see how this is played out even to this day. The Arab nation is, it's very large, but it's very fractured. It's continually in conflict. And the Jewish nation is blessed beyond comparison. 0.2% of the world's population is Jewish. 41% of all Nobel Prize winners in economics are Jewish. Almost a third of all Nobel Prize winners in all categories are Jewish. They represent 11%. Remember, they're 0.2% of the world's population. They represent 11% of the billionaires. 20% of the world's richest 50 people are Jewish. They represent 2% of the U.S. population, but they're 25% of the richest people in the U.S. Jews in the U.S. have a net worth that is 6 times greater than Christians. I don't know who calculates these things, but obviously somebody does. There are 15 million Jews worldwide. Anybody want to guess how many Arabs there are worldwide? How many? A billion? No. But there are 436 million Arabs. 15 million Jews from Isaac, 436 million Arabs from Ishmael. Again, a lot of questions when I get to heaven. I still have about 10 pages of notes, so we're not going to get through this message. And I had a really good illustration that I was going to use. And now Brooklyn won't get her illustration used. Okay, I'm going to take about 4 minutes, and then we're going to do the handing out of the stuff. Maybe we'll do Brooklyn's illustration. So in all of this, we have this idea that when you choose not to go outside of God's promise, it usually something not particularly good happens. Sarah did not listen to God. She went outside of God's promise. She didn't wait for the supernatural. She wanted the natural. And because of that, we have the Arab nation in conflict for the rest of its life. Even though she went outside of the promise, The important thing is here is God always keeps his promise. And so even though she didn't wait and she didn't listen, God still honored his promise to her, and the Jewish nation was born. I was going to go into Galatians Chapter 4, which is sort of the application in the New Testament about what happens with Ishmael and Isaac. And in Galatians Chapter 4, in a really quick summary, it says, you could be like the slave, or you could be like the free woman. You can be like Hagar, or you could be like Sarah. And he says, remember, this is Paul speaking to a Gentile church, but with Jews in it. He's saying, you Jews, you are all like Hagar. You are born into slavery. You are not free. And the Jews must have been saying, well, no, we're the children of Sarah, not the children of Hagar. But he's saying, you are so caught up in your rules and so caught up in your regulations, you are slave to all of that, even though you should be free. And on the other side of it, he says, to the Gentiles, you're the free ones because you have salvation on faith. You are not stuck to all the rules and regulations. You understand that freedom comes only through the grace given by Jesus Christ. And then we have this idea of freedom, and what does it mean? The Jews thought they were free, but they weren't. They were completely enslaved to the laws that they had. The Gentiles, as he's saying, were the ones that were free because they believed in faith. In studying this, there was sort of this idea of what is freedom, because we've used this word for the last 6 or 7 months in all sorts of different ways. And there was a really good illustration that I thought of, and then I found an even better one. And so the idea is, what is freedom? So you have to have opportunity, you have to have ability, and you have to have desire. Those are the things that make up freedom. So when we were at the cottage, everybody's going in the water, and they're going in the sauna, they're jumping off the dock. Brooklyn says, I want to jump in. And so she would go to the end of the dock, and she would stand there. And then she would run back to the shore. Did she have opportunity? Yes. We were all saying, you can go in the water. She had a bathing suit on. She could jump in the water if she wanted. The opportunity was there. The water was open. Everybody else was jumping in. Complete opportunity. She was completely free to do that, but she chose not to. Did she have the ability? I know she can swim. I've seen her jump. I know that she had the ability to do what she could do, but again, she chose not to. Did she have the desire? She really, really badly wanted to go in the water. For 40 minutes, she walked back and forth between the dock and the shore. I really want to go in. In fact, at one point she says, Rob, come and throw me in the water. And so I went out to the dock and I picked her up and she went, no, don't throw me in, don't throw me in. So I put her back down. Another 20 minutes go by. She had the desire, but she was frozen by what? Fear. Fear kept her from going in the water. It's cold. It's cold. I'm going to get cold if I go in. Fear of the unknown. In the same way that when we talk about freedom, it's not usually the ability, it's not usually opportunity, it's not even usually desire. Those three things, when they come together, are often canceled out by fear. And the fear is what holds us enslaved. If we read this whole passage in Galatians, we would know they were enslaved by all of these things that they had put on themselves, and Paul's saying to them, it's not the way it is. Don't be a Hagar, be a Sarah, be a child of promise, not a child of slavery. And so that really is my message for today, that Hagar's kind of a strange person that we ignore, and we can't ignore those people. God sees and hears and allows that person to see him. And to me, that's pretty impressive. And that we should live our life not as a slave, but as a free person that God has made us, and a free person that is alive today by the grace of God. So let's just pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your goodness to us and your love for us. We thank you for just these illustrations, something that happened so long ago, 4,500 years ago. Hager and Sarah started this through down history, and we have the Arab nation and the Israel nation growing up out of that. And Lord, we see your hand in it. We don't always understand. There are things in this story that we do not understand and why it is the way it is. But I think this idea of knowing that you are a God who sees, and that we can see the God who sees us, is just a really incredible, powerful thing to know and to understand. So Lord, that we would just go out today, we would live our lives as free people, that we won't have our freedom taken away by fear. And Father, we are grateful for our salvation, and I am grateful for that. And we pray in your Son's name. Amen.